Welcome to another episode of Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Simpler Miller, and my guest today is Rosie Whitehouse. Now, she's the author of the new book, Two Sisters: Betrayal, Love, and Resistance in Wartime France. But and she's going to share the survival story. But we're going to go back. Rosie and I have just been talking literally to World War One, to the beginning of the stab in the back, the German lie about the Jews, based on the census that Rosie is going to tell you about. Go ahead, Rosie.
Well, Two Sisters is a book about my mother-in-law, and her name was Marion Muller, but I can always only ever think of her as Granny Marion. So I do apologize if in the conversation I talk about Granny Marion, but she's always like that for me. And her sister Huguette. Huguette was not born Huguette. She was born Inga Margot, and the sisters were born in Berlin. Granny Marion was born in 1920. Her parents ran a very successful, their grandparents also ran it, a very successful textile business in Berlin. They had a factory which produced Egyptian cotton in Cottbus. And the sister's father, he had fought in the First World War. And the much of the records of the regiment that he was in, he came from Berlin, so he was in a regiment from Berlin, were destroyed in the Second World War. But the physical evidence that we know about it is that he lost his foot in the First World War, but he lost his foot prior to the Battle of the Somme. And he was at the Battle of the Somme, where he worked as an interpreter, because he had been at university in France prior to the war. And what's very interesting, I think, in the story of what happened to German Jews is that they fought valiantly for their country. My husband's grandfather, he lost his foot. I mean, the trauma of losing the foot was so enormous that his hair fell out and never grew back. But after the massacre at the Battle of the Somme, the government in Germany decided that they were going to carry out a census to find out exactly what Jewish soldiers were doing. They were going to count them and find out where they had been in battle. And they weren't just counting the living soldiers, they were also counting the dead. Now, this became a very controversial move, which is hardly surprising. And the results of the survey were never published. But you can see here, beginning from 1916 onwards, the growth of what became known as the stab in the back, which was part of this theory, which was perpetrated by the Nazis and others, not just the Nazis, that Germany had been stabbed in the back by a coalition of communists, left-wingers, and Jews.
Okay, wait, I got to
Um,
explain. We're talking about stab in the back, it means that's why Germany lost the war. In
That's
other
why
words,
Germany lost the war, and also why Germany lost the Kaiser, because of course, immediately after 1918, Germany descends into immense chaos, and actually, it's very dramatic in our family story because the factory was in Prenzlauer Berg, which is in East Berlin, and this was a scene of the Spartacist uprising, and actually, it's very easy to forget, but my husband's grandfather, he said to him, well, if I hadn't been a Jew, I might have supported the Nazis because Germany was collapsing. And it was collapsing in 1918 when he then met and fell in love with Edith. And they married. And in 1920, just at the time the reparations bill was slapped on the table, they had a baby, and that was Granny Marion.
got it. And do you want to quickly say who the Spartacus revolt was?
Well, the Spartakists were communists led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, who rose up trying to copy the Bolshevik Revolution, which had occurred in Russia in 1917. These uprisings were not unusual in Europe at the time. Of course, we have Bela Kun in Budapest. The continent was in turmoil. This is what war produces, and it's something that we have to remember now, that war produces an intensity of views, and it produces chaos on the ground. And one of the real problems that had happened in Germany was terrible, terrible shortages of food, and Germany was defeated as much economically as it was on the battlefield. And this is also why you get this stab on the battlefield, because they felt the country had imploded within itself.
Yes, and I remember, in the famous nonfiction, fiction novel, All Quiet on the Western Front. At the end, the German army has almost no food, and yet they're still being told that they're winning. And so that it led to the stab in the back because Germany wasn't occupied in World War I the way it was in World War II. And the people were willing to believe, oh, we would have won, except blah, 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 blah.
Yes, and this chaos it rolls on right the way through into the early 1920s. And in my book, I write about one of Granny Marion's most favorite first memories, and also a memory in which she was intensely proud of her mother, was during the hyperinflation. She went to the local bakery shop and she traded her gloves for a loaf of bread. I can imagine this really impressed the 3-year-old Granny Marion that her mother could literally magic bread from nowhere. But this gives you an illustration of what the crisis is like. And I myself have lived through intense hyperinflation. My husband's a foreign correspondent, and we lived in Belgrade in the 1990s when there was such intense hyperinflation that this story from the past was part of our present, because I would change my money from pounds into dinar, and then I would literally have to run to the shops to spend it because the price was going up exponentially. So this is chaos. It's real chaos where people are running to the shops and trying to get there before the shops close the door. So the chaos in Germany was unbelievable. And as I said to you, the family ran this big business. Now, this is really difficult during the First World War with the blockades and then the chaos, the financial chaos. But my husband's grandfather, he was in charge of the financial side of the business, and he floated the business on the stock market. And by mid 1920s, the business was doing really well, as was Germany, and things were very successful. But of course,
And we need to say they had a constitution called and it was called the Weimar Republic. That it's because that's where the Constitution was signed, Weimar, in case anyone wants to know where that word comes from. But when we talk about the Weimar Republic, they now have a constitution, even though there's still all this physical street fighting going on. Okay.
Yeah, the Weimar Constitution was also very controversial because it was introduced by left-wing politicians. So it also builds into this whole stab in the back theory. Weimar is also, if we wanted to see where this road is going, one of the most famous concentration camps is on Ettersberg Hill, just outside Weimar. It's called Buchenwald. So and Weimar really became a center of Nazi propaganda during the 1930s, largely because of this.
Now, Hitler's about to be democratically chosen as chancellor. And what happens to your family?
Well, the very first thing was that my mother-in-law was very frightened by what she saw on the streets, Jews being beaten up.
Okay, wait, give us the month of
This is January 1933.
So
They
Hitler
leave in
takes
the summer
power
of
on the 30th.
1933.
Okay,
Hitler comes to power on the 30th of January, 1933.
right.
Immediately afterwards, Jews are targeted on the streets of Berlin. My mother-in-law witnesses this with her own eyes and was very frightened. This she told us. At this point, I think as part of this story and part of how I wrote the book, I should say my mother-in-law talked about what happened to her, but she was very selective about what she said. So she left many questions hanging in the air, which is why I came to write this book, because I was looking for answers that she had not given us. And as a daughter-in-law, I did not want to press my mother-in-law to answer questions she did not want to answer. But she always said that she was frightened by what she saw on the street. And then the other thing that happened to her was that she decided to join the Scouts. And when she went to join the Scouts, they asked her if she had any Jewish parents or grandparents. And she came home and told her father. And she always said that that was the final straw. That's when he knew he had to go. And this became a tremendous moment within the family. Henriette, who ran the company, Edith's mother, she decided that her daughters with children should leave. So Edith's sister Lily, she went to Palestine, and Edith wanted to go to America because her husband's brother had gone to America, where he became a very famous orthopedic surgeon in New York. And Edith wanted to go to New York. There were terrible, terrible rows in the family, which Granny Marion's sister Huguette still remembers. But Johannes, who's the name of my husband's grandfather, he did not speak English. Well, not that Edith it did either, but he spoke fluent French because he'd been at the Sorbonne before the war. And he saw the future in France. And I find this very interesting about the mentality of how you really become a survivor, because he survived the Holocaust, is that his mind literally flicked from being a stalwart German nationalist who was willing to fight and experience the First World War and had fought to rebuild the economic foundations of the Weimar Republic. He suddenly decides he's going to France. He's only going to speak French. He changes his name. He becomes Jean-Paul. He's no longer Johannes Muller. He's Jean-Paul Muller. And he says his family should only speak French and they have to be as totally Christian as they possibly can. So the Mullers go into hiding in 1933. But interestingly enough, his father, who was also a very famous orthopedic surgeon in Berlin, had converted to become a Presbyterian in the 1890s. So actually the Muller family had been in hiding since the 1890s. And I think you have to remember this because it was a conversion of convenience. That's always how Granny Marion put it.
Okay,
And
I realize I need to clarify. When you say the word hiding, you mean they disguised their Jewish background. You
hiding
didn't
in
mean,
plain sight.
yes, you didn't
There's
mean that they
two
had kept
kinds
it.
of hiding in the Holocaust. One
Right.
is hiding in a cellar, one is hiding in someone's bedroom, and the other one is hiding in plain sight. And this is really important when you come to talk about Western Europe. Obviously, it happens in Poland. There were people who had blonde hair and were able to pass as Aryans who hid in plain sight. But in France and in Italy, many Jews hid literally in plain sight. They just pretended they were somebody else. And the
But so they
fact
never
that
registered with the Jewish community when they got to where were
no,
they?
no, they never.
France.
They registered a church. Granny Marion went to a convent school in Nantes on the west coast of France, and they had to go to church every Sunday. And Huguette was confirmed, but her mother always reminded her that she was Jewish. And in the long run, I think that this actually saved them because those Jews who had forgotten that they were actually Jewish were really caught off guard during what happened in France. But we'll get to that in a minute. We're jumping ahead.
Okay, so now they're in France, hiding in plain sight, not hiding. And are they, is her grandfather now running a business in France? What's the story
He
here?
became completely French, as I said, and he also had a complete flick because he had been part of this matriarchal company in Berlin, which was run by the mother-in-law. So he not only lost his foot, he'd been somewhat emasculated, I think, by his mother-in-law. So when he gets to France, he suddenly becomes a new man. Not only does he change his name, he becomes a film producer, and he produces films. A lot of them are still in the French film archives. Some of them are known as Camembert Westerns. They were shot in the Camargue. And he was a very successful film producer. And when Granny Marion left school, she went to work for him. And she was dreaming of being an actress. This is 1939. And the family were very successful. When they came as immigrants. That was limited what money you could bring out.
Yeah, I would
I
just
mean, they
point
weren't
out
always
33,
wealthy.
you
For
could,
example, they had a Chrysler car in Berlin. These things were like priceless, but of course they all had to be abandoned. But he made a lot of money, and he ended up living in the 8th arrondissement. Those of you who've been to Paris, you will know the 8th arrondissement because it's near Parc Monceau. It's a very smart part of Paris. If you want to be smart, that's where you live.
oh,
And they lived
smart
in
means
beautiful apartments.
fashionable. You can tell that Rose.
In English, yes, it
Yes,
does.
we're,
Yes.
you can tell we're having a little bit of, but I wanted to just say one thing because I always try and for Holocaust deniers and distorters, make things clear. In 33, you could probably take some money out of Germany. As the years went on before the war, you could take less and less and less out. So,
Well, they left on a train. He left first after these bitter arguments that I just talked about.
so
And
what,
Granny
so what
Marion,
month did they leave?
I don't know the month, but in the summer,
Of
they
33.
arrived in time for him, for the kids to go to school in September. And Huguette's very first memory is stepping down at the Gare de Lyon, and arriving in Paris. And this is the trauma of refugees. And this is where I think the story is relevant in the contemporary situation, because Huguette went to school in Paris that September. She was bullied at school. She was still then called Inga Margot, and the children at school called her Singe, which is the French for monkey. Um, whether they were just picking on her or there was some other vibes going on, I don't really know. But she then decided she wasn't going to speak for 6 months because she couldn't speak French. So for 6 months, she did not open her mouth. And then 6 months later, she opened her mouth and announced she was going to be called Huguette, because the girl in the class who was the most successful was called Huguette. And her marks at school were very bad. Interestingly enough, Huguette went on to be a French teacher, but this was a traumatic experience to be a refugee in this period. A lot of people think, that if you went to France and you experienced the Holocaust in France, you weren't really a Holocaust survivor.
Oh,
I remember when I first met my husband, he was like, I don't know if my mother's really a Holocaust survivor. And I'm like, yes, of course she is. Don't be stupid. And people think it was Holocaust light in France during the war. And one of the things I really tried to show in the book, that this was not the case. And this is something that was recognized at the Eichmann trial, where one of the people who gave evidence at Eichmann's trial was George Wellers, who talked about the 4,000 children who were deported from France without their parents. Their parents had previously been deported, and these children had been born in France and were French nationals. So there's no such thing as Holocaust light anywhere in Europe.
oh, I 100% agree. I find it fascinating that there are people who say, no, no, you can't say that person's a Holocaust survivor. Feel that if they were in a country where they would have been liable to be killed if they hadn't gone somewhere, yes, they are a Holocaust survivor.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
And so I just wanted to clarify which sister was older. I'm just curious.
Granny Marion was older. She was born in 1920, and Huguette was born in 1927. So when Huguette arrived in Paris in 1933, she was only 5 years old. So this was the real trauma. One thing that I found, because Granny Marion, she moved to London in 1960, and she married her second husband here in London, which is why we live in London. And after she died and I was clearing out her cupboards, I found these little notebooks in which she had learned English, and she had written whole sentences in English, so she could go to the shop to repeat them, or to repeat them when she met people, because she didn't speak English when she came to London. Interesting enough, she always spoke English with a French accent, which is interesting.
Well, that's it.
So
I like
she
that.
must have done the same thing in her room in Paris after they moved there. She must have written down every single sentence so she could parrot it back at people. Whereas Huguette was far too small and was suffering this intense trauma. Granny Marion at this point was obviously 13 years old, and she was much older and much more capable. So as the big sister, she was already always protecting Huguette. And I suppose really, because we could talk about this, well, it's evening here in London, we could talk about it all evening, but we have other things to do, is that I think we should fast forward here a little bit, to, since we're thinking about how Granny Marion was protecting her sister, and this is the reason that I wrote Two Sisters, the book, is that in 2019, I work with Holocaust survivors all the time here in the UK, and I explain to their families, their histories and all this kind of stuff, and I write books about the Holocaust. And through doing this, I began to realize that that we really didn't know enough about her own Holocaust story. So we went in 2019 to visit Huguette in San Francisco, and my husband started to interview her, to ask her questions. It was the last chance saloon to get some of these questions answered. I'm sure many of the people who are listening to this have been there. And she struggled to remember things. And we wanted to ask her about this particular incident, which had always fascinated me, was that her mother was deported to Auschwitz in October 1943. This is no big surprise. My husband told me this on our first date.
Wait. Why was she deported? Oh,
Well, she was arrested in Nice, and
because she didn't have, their
though
papers showed that they were Germans, right? Not Jews, but Germans.
she was caught in a trap going to get false papers in Nice in September 1943 after the Germans invaded and took over Nice. But she was then deported to Auschwitz. While she was in Auschwitz, the family were denaturalized. They'd been naturalized French in 1938. This is an important part of the story too. But I want to go to this core part of
Okay, go
what
ahead, and then we'll
happened
come
to the
back
two
to talking
sisters.
about Vichy France.
Is that I could never understand what my mother-in-law and Huguette were doing in Val d'Isère in the winter of 1943, just after their mother had been deported. Granny Marion often used to wave it away and say, I was there during the Italian control. Well, she wasn't, because the Italians had gone by then. And through the research that I did for this book, I discovered actually that my mother-in-law worked for the Jewish resistance in France, and that she was in Val d'Isère because by this point, if you had false papers, it wasn't a question of just getting a printout and writing a name on it and pretending it was real. You had to have proper official papers, and you had to be registered as somebody who really existed and lived in a village or town. So when the Nazis or the Vichy police got you and they called on the telephone, they said, does blah, blah live in this town? They go, oh, yes, of course she does. And then they would have duplicates of the ration tickets and all other things which were issued every month. So every month, my mother-in-law went and did a turn through the Alps to collect all the ration cards and everything for all the people who needed them. And that's what she was doing in Val d'Isère. But what happened when she was in Val d'Isère was that Huguette couldn't ski, and they were trying to pretend they were on a skiing holiday as a cover, and she slipped and she broke her leg. And the local doctor was called. He was called Dr. Frédéric Petrie. And Petrie arrived and told Granny Marion that the break in the leg was so bad that Huguette had to go to the hospital down in Bourg Saint-Maurice. Now, Granny Marion, who was an extremely calm person, punched Dr. Petrie in the face at this point, when he quickly got the message that there was something going on and that these girls were Jewish. And he said to Granny Marion, you leave, I'll look after Huguette. She comes with me for 6 months, and in 6 months, exactly 6 months, you come back and collect her. We have no communication. And he took Huguette into his house, and he cared for her in secret. And this is really an extraordinary story, and it's at the heart of the two sisters story, because Granny Marion was trying to protect Huguette, and then Dr. Petrie came in and basically saved their lives. So when Huguette began to really open up about this story, and she asked me if I could find the Petrie family, which I did, Dr. Petrie went on to become the mayor of Val d'Isère, and he was one of the key people who turned Val d'Isère into one of the most famous ski resorts in the world. So it wasn't very difficult to find him, I have to say. But nobody in Val d'Isère and none of his family knew that he had ever hidden a Jewish child. And we had him recognized as righteous among nations, which was the result of this story. And I know much of what you like to do on your podcast is talk about the present as well as the past. And this process of recognizing him as righteous among nations was, well, I think one of the most meaningful things I've ever done in my life. On one side, it changed our opinion of the Holocaust. Granny Marion's Holocaust was very dark and she didn't want to talk about it. Huguette had a much more positive vision, which came from Dr. Petrie, that good things could come out of it. So now as a family, we feel quite positive about it, if you can feel positive about
Yes,
Holocaust.
I'm fine.
But what's important is also that now all the children in Val d'Isère will learn about what Dr. Petrie did. And actually, as a consequence of me having him recognized as righteous among nations, many, many other Jews who were hidden in Val d'Isere suddenly came out of the woodwork, and the families who hid them. And now the people in Val d'Isere have much to be proud of. And I think that this is very important well, it's important anywhere in the world, but it's important in contemporary Europe, where we have been dealing with a refugee crisis since 2016.
I, just for people who don't know, only non-Jews can be recognized by Yad Vashem for saving Jews. And it's not an easy process to get Yad Vashem to say yes. I take it you had to have a lot of documentation and
Well, firstly, let's just deal with the question of the documentation. Yes, I was told it could take years. You have to prove certain things. You have to prove that no money was exchanged. Well, basically, Granny Mary and Huguette didn't have any money, and Huguette remembered that the family shared all their food with her. And it was Huguette's memories of what happened, which really swung it very quickly. And actually, it only took us 6 months to have him recognized as righteous among nations, largely also because many people who were righteous were repeat righteous. They didn't just do it once. And he saved a British airman who was stranded after Huguette had left in the winter of 1940, not 44, 45. He got message that some British POWs, prisoners of war, were trying to walk over the Col d'Isere. The Col d'Isere is the highest peak outside of Georgia in Europe. So we're talking winter, the highest peak. And Dr. Petrie went up to rescue them, where these men were stranded in a snowdrift, just wearing just their prisoners of war outfits. And he carried back this one particular prisoner of war and cared for him and looked after him. Again, he didn't tell anybody about it. And it was only later, when this man came to Val d'Isere to try to find him to say thank you, that anybody discovered what he'd done. So I think it's this repeat actions of being righteous and not talking about it. These are all classic syndromes. But let's go back to this point you just made a few minutes ago about the fact that it's only non-Jews. And I think this is very important. Obviously, when Ben-Gurion introduced the concept of righteous among nations, it was in the 1950s, when he's really pushing. He wants to get reparations off Germany. He's being pushed by the Claims Conference. And so the hard bit comes with a sweetie. So, right, we'll recognize some people as righteous among nations if you give us the money. And this really carries on after the Eichmann trial. You've seen similar things in other countries. It's been exactly the same in France in the 1990s, is that you're trying to push for something and then you give people a sweetie. But the real consequence, I think, for Jewish history from this is that it means that we don't really understand the amount of Jews who saved other Jews. And this is hidden away. And in my research to discover what Granny Marion was doing and the extent of Jewish resistance in France, you discover that there are literally thousands of Jews in France who are involved in the resistance. They even had a thing called the Army Juif, the Jewish army. And that Jewish army joined with de Gaulle's free forces and fought into Germany. So the level of resistance in France is shockingly unknown. But one of this is the contribution of this Righteous Among Nations program. I'm not knocking it. And I know that there's lots of controversy with righteous and they can be used and abused. We've seen it in Poland. It's a fantastic thing, in my opinion, but it does have this long lasting consequence for what people think about Jews and think about the fact that they didn't resist. Yes, they resisted in vast numbers.
I think B'nai B'rith, as I recall, does have a recognition for Jews who
They
saved
do,
other
yes.
Jews, but it's not as well known. I
No.
mean, and so that's one of the things I try and do with my programs is talk about Jewish resistance, and so that people understand not everyone went willingly. I mean, I
Well,
think the
sorry, I
fact
didn't
that
mean
your
to.
husband's great grandfather had the seichel, the common sense, in 33, right after Hitler became chancellor, is amazing.
But also the other aspect of the family story, which obviously I write about in Two Sisters, is actually about Granny Marion's first husband, because she came here to London and she married my father-in-law, but she was previously married to a man called Pierre Aymin. Pierre Aymin was from Paris. He was Jewish. Originally from Alsace. This is very significant because many people from Alsace became resistants because Alsace had been occupied by the Germans prior to the First World War. Uh, Pierre was in he was in the French army. He fought valiantly and was then taken as a prisoner of war. He escaped from the prisoner of war camp. That's his first act of resistance. And he went to Lyon. Lyon is in south of France, a big industrial city, university city. And there he met Granny Marion in 1940. And they fell in love in a whirlwind, and he joined the resistance. They both joined the resistance there. He was in the general resistance in Lyon, very involved in it. I don't exactly know which group he was involved in, but in 1942, the resistance in Lyon was infiltrated, and the Nazis then in November 1942 invaded the Free Zone, what we call Vichy France, and it became increasingly dangerous to be a resistor in Lyon. And
Hey,
he
Kathleen,
decided
can I
that,
tie this into history as I understand it? I always wanted to know why the Germans in November of 42 decided to take over Vichy France, which was called the Free Zone, because of what was happening in Africa influenced what they did because South of France is across from Africa. So just to
yeah,
kind of put people in
yeah,
understanding.
the big sea change in November 1942 is the Allied victories in North Africa. Now, it suddenly means that the Allies can push up across
Right.
the Mediterranean, and this is what puts the all of these ports across the Mediterranean as targets for the Nazis. But firstly, where you could have an Allied landing, but of course, the Nazis believed that Jews were a fifth column about to stab them in the back. So you've got to get rid of Jews in all these ports. It's why you see the big roundup in Thessalonica. It's why you see the roundup in Marseille. It's why you see the roundup in Nice. These places become targets. But anyway, going back to Pierre Aymin and November 1942, he decided he was going to leave Lyon and he was going to walk over the Pyrenees and try to come to London to join General de Gaulle's Free French. He asked Granny Marion to go with him. She said no. It was Christmas Day when he crossed the Pyrenees. I mean, he would have been wearing ordinary shoes and a suit. Again, these are not mountains to joke with. And she said that she would have frozen to death. I don't think that that was actually the reason. I think she stayed because she wanted to try to help her mother and to help Huguette. And anyway, Pierre walked over the mountains into Spain. He was then interned in an internment camp in Spain for 6 months. He was then got out by the British because he'd been working for SOE, the Special Operations Executive, who were the secret agents of Winston Churchill. He was then taken to Madrid and then down to Gibraltar, and he was flown to the UK, where he joined. He was trained by SOE. He was trained to be a special operative who was a saboteur. Basically, he was trained to blow things up. He was then selected to go back to join General de Gaulle's. It's called the BCRA. It's the French version of SOE, and they divided France into these different sections. And he was paired with a Protestant called Bernard Schlumberger, and they were sent into a region called T4, which is in southwest France around Toulouse. Now, what is a Jew and a Protestant doing parachuting out of a British plane over the Toulouse area? Well, the answer is good old Jewish resistance, because up in the town of Varbes and the valley that runs from Varbes to Lacan was the most incredible Protestant resistance and Jewish resistance. And Pierre Schlumberger was the cousin of the wife of the man in charge of the Protestant resistance. And Pierre and his colleague were sent in to unite these groups so that they could fight together. And indeed they did. And they liberated Castres. And then the Jews and the Protestants together fought on into Germany as part of the Free French. So that's another interesting story of French resistance.
And what happened? Pierre was French, is that correct?
Yeah, it was French, yes.
And
And
what happened? Yeah.
after his job of teaching people to blow train sky high in the Toulouse region, he moved on upwards um, because Das Reich, who had just come from the Eastern Front, were moving across the south of France, up from Toulouse, heading up towards Normandy, basically. And they needed to be harassed and to be stopped. And it was his job to do that. They went to Cahors, and much of the work that he did ended up in this most terrible German retaliation at Oradour-Saint-Glan.
Oh,
Uh, the
yes,
whole village was
village.
destroyed.
Yes,
But Pierre
not
was a
Jews.
major a member of the resistance. After the war, if you were a member of the resistance, you got allocated flats which had previously belonged to people who had collaborated during the French occupation. And Granny Marion gave birth to her oldest daughter in January 1945. And so she was pregnant in September, October 1944. And they were delayed in going back to Paris. And she was always annoyed she did not get a flat on the Champ du Mars, which is where the Eiffel Tower is. So, but it gives you an indication of how important Pierre was in the resistance, that he really deserved a flat from a collaborator on Champ du Mars. They got one in the next street, but she was always irked.
I will just share the story of that village. My husband and I were stationed in Munich with the U.S. Army from September 70 to May of 72. At one point during that time, I have the newspaper article, but I can't recall the date right now. The Waffen SS, who had destroyed the village, meaning all the people in it, murdered everyone, had an open reunion outside Munich, and they were known for what they'd done. It was not a secret, as I recall. The article was in the Stars and Stripes, the Army newspaper, and it said, "Yes, we're just having a reunion for our brotherhood forged in blood." So that's an interesting perspective on.
Well, the other interesting perspective actually in Oradour-sur-Glane was that people were burned alive in the church. But among them were some Jews who were being hidden in Oradour-sur-Glane. So it gives you an indication of a lot of what was going on in France. And one of the things that I found really interesting in researching my book was that actually just how important public opinion was in France during the Second World War. We have this idea that I think much of it comes from the big screen, is that Nazis are all powerful. And they were not really, because and in France it shows you that they pulled back many, many times from carrying out the final solution in France. I'm sorry to use that word, but it's the only one we have really. And so, for example, when Laval discovered that the deportations that happened in the summer of 1942 were very unpopular with the public and with the clergy, he cancelled all deportations, and no deportation trains left from France for 4 months. Now, nothing happened. Nobody shot anybody. Nobody did anything. And I think this is really intriguing. So that when you see people standing up and starting to change their opinion about what should happen, it shows, and this is a real story for the present, is that it shows that everybody has got a moral compass, and you can't just assume that things that are going on in the world are too big and that you can't do something about it. And here's a story which may reflect that at the ceremony in Val d'Isère when Dr. Petrie was made righteous among nations, my husband, who's a foreign correspondent, he gave a very moving speech, and he covers the war in Ukraine. And he said at the ceremony that we need in Europe many more Dr. Petries, because he had seen the bodies in Bucha. And this is a problem which is not one of the past, it's one of the present.
Yes, you very true words. Very compelling words. And I thank you so much for sharing this history, but also this history that reminds us of what individuals can do, and that you don't have to just accept the status quo even at a very small grassroots level, you can think about what can I do? How can I change things? So this has been a really, really important discussion. I'm going to leave, if people want to know, the link to the book on Amazon will be in the description in this YouTube episode. I would thank Rosie. I thank the listeners. And as I end every episode, I say, please, may the memory of the victims and those that tried to save them be a blessing forever.